Mercy General's morning light filtered through windows that hadn't been cleaned since April, casting shadows across corridors that smelled of antiseptic and something underneath, copper, old fear, the specific scent of people waiting for test results they didn't want. Hannah Clarke moved through these hallways like water through a sieve, present but unnoticed, her feet making no sound on the linoleum despite walking 17 miles per shift, the kind of distance you learn to measure in a place where every step mattered. 5 years. That's how long her nursing license had existed on paper. 5 years and nothing before that, or rather, everything before that existed in files marked classified, in operations that officially never happened, in a Helmand Province valley where names got crossed out in gold thread and replaced with silence. Her badge clipped to scrubs the color of pale blue sky, a color chosen specifically because it wouldn't stand out, wouldn't draw attention, wouldn't make anyone look twice. Hannah checked the assignment board outside the nursing station, room 342, post-op knee replacement, routine, room 344, diabetic neuropathy, stable, room 347, cardiac post-op day 2, Admiral James Whitmore, 72 years old, recovering from emergency bypass surgery performed by Dr. Marcus Sterling, whose reputation depended on maintaining 3 things: his surgical outcomes, his departmental hierarchy, and the lie that he was the smartest man in any room he entered. The Admiral's chart showed what she already knew without looking: normal sinus rhythm, blood pressure stable at 118/76, O2 saturation 97% on room air, pain controlled with scheduled morphine. She knew this because she'd checked his vitals at 0600 and again at 0700, her hands moving through the ritual of blood pressure cuff and pulse oximetry with the kind of precision that comes from muscle memory, the kind that made people nervous without knowing why. When she adjusted his for during the 0700 check, the fluid line caught the morning light and she saw it, the edge of a tattoo on his left forearm, partially obscured by the post-op bandaging. Her hand froze for exactly 1 second, a micro-pause that would have been invisible to anyone not trained to notice such things, and then she continued, her expression resetting to professional neutrality, the kind of careful blankness she'd perfected across 38 years of living and 5 years of pretending to be someone else. She pulled her hand back. The Admiral's eyes remained closed. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm in another room down the hall, and Hannah moved on, her jaw tight enough to crack teeth, though her face showed nothing. By 0800, she'd completed the morning assessments on her 7 patients, updated the electronic records with the kind of meticulous documentation that made auditors weep with joy, and walked toward her locker at the far end of the nurses' station where nobody went because it was shoved behind the supply carts and the broken temperature gauge. Inside, hanging on the single hook, was her jacket, the same jacket she'd worn for 4 years, canvas the color of faded moss, with careful stitches along the lining where the patch lived. 8 names embroidered in gold thread. 3 of them crossed out in black, careful diagonal lines that covered the names but not the memory. She reached out and traced one of the crossed-out names, her fingertip following the X, and that's when the voice cut through the hallway like a scalpel through flesh. Nurse Clarke. Not a question. Not a greeting. A summons delivered by Dr. Marcus Sterling, whose voice carried the particular authority of someone who'd never been told no by anyone who mattered, whose presence made the air pressure change in the room because he walked as if the space had been arranged specifically for him. He was 47, wore Italian loafers that cost more than her rent, and carried himself with the kind of confidence that existed independent of actual competence, though he was competent, which made him dangerous. He stood at the entrance to the nurse's station wearing his white coat like armor, his attending badge clipped to his lapel with the kind of precision that suggested he practiced it in the mirror. "Doctor," Hannah said, closing her locker quietly and turning to face him. Her voice stayed level, deferential without being submissive, the voice of someone who understood hierarchy and respected it not because of its justice but because she understood what happened when you didn't. "I need you on rounds," Sterling said, and it wasn't an invitation. "Bring the charts for 340 through 355. "Yes, doctor." She gathered the charts with efficient movements, her hands steady, her face blank. She'd learned this version of invisibility in Helmand Province, where drawing attention meant ending up in a body bag, and she'd maintained it for 5 years at Mercy General because drawing attention meant ending up unemployed, which was a different kind of ending. The interns trailed behind Sterling like remoras behind a shark, their white coats bright and new and full of the kind of hope that wouldn't survive more than 3 months in rail medicine. Hannah followed at a respectful distance, the charts organized in the correct order, her attention focused entirely on the role she'd been assigned. The ward rounds proceeded with the mechanical precision of a well-rehearsed ritual. Sterling swept into each room, examined the patients with a careful attention that was absolutely performative. The patients mattered less than the appearance of caring, the careful choreography of concern arranged specifically for the benefit of the interns who would report back to the program directors and potentially to people who evaluated his standing. Room 340, adequate progress, continue current regimen. Room 342, range of motion improving, discharge planning proceeding as expected. Room 343, standard post-op trajectory. By room 345, an elderly woman post-op from a hip replacement, something shifted. Sterling reviewed the chart with the kind of cursory attention that suggested he'd already moved on mentally to whatever problem he actually cared about, and he said, the heparin infusion is set at 14 units per kilogram per hour. Is that correct? The intern, a young man with a name badge that read Dr. Patterson, nodded carefully. Yes, sir. That's the standard post-op anticoagulation protocol for. That's incorrect, Hannah said quietly. The silence that followed wasn't the absence of sound. It was the presence of something else, something heavy and waiting. Sterling's head turned toward her with the precision of a predator identifying movement in tall grass. His eyes were a pale blue that looked attractive in photographs and murderous in person. The intern stared at the floor. The other nurses pretended to be checking monitors in rooms they'd already checked. I'm sorry. Sterling's voice had taken on a particular quality, the vocal equivalent of placing his hand on a weapon. The standard post-op heparin dosing for orthopedic patients is 14 units per kilogram per hour, but Ms. Brennan in room 345 has documented renal insufficiency, Hannah said, speaking with the kind of factual precision that left no room for disagreement or interpretation. The eGFR is 38, which puts her in stage 3B chronic kidney disease. At standard dosing, her steady-state levels will exceed the therapeutic range by approximately 18%, placing her at increased risk for bleeding complications. The appropriate dose adjustment is 11 units per kilogram per hour, corrected for her creatinine clearance. She paused. Her hands remained perfectly still. Her expression showed nothing at all. Per the pharmacy protocol memo issued in March of this year, which you signed, Hannah continued in that same flat, professional voice, any patient with creatinine clearance below 40 requires dose adjustment. The memo is on the intranet under the clinical guidelines section. I can pull it up if you need a reference. The intern's eyes had widened to the size of coins. One of the other nurses had stopped pretending to check the monitor. The hallway seemed to have acquired extra fluorescent lights, all of them humming at once, all of them making the moment feel exposed and permanent. Sterling's jaw had tightened, a muscle working just below his right ear, and when he spoke again, his voice had become something soft and dangerous. Thank you, Nurse Clarke. That will be all. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came 4 hours later in the hospital cafeteria at 1200, where Sterling sat with a table of 3 other attending physicians and 2 pharmaceutical representatives who were buying lunch as part of their quarterly relationship maintenance budget. Hannah had come in only to grab coffee and a protein bar because the shift was long and the vending machines never restocked the almonds, and she made the mistake of standing in the line where Sterling could see her over the shoulder of a radiologist named Chen. You know, I've got money riding on something, Sterling said, his voice pitched to carry, the kind of announcement designed specifically to draw attention from adjacent tables. I'm betting that the new nurse on my service, the one who clearly thinks she knows more than I do, I'm betting she won't make it a week. What do you all think? Week seems generous. The other doctors laughed. One of them, a woman named Patel who Hannah had always found competent and kind, didn't laugh, but she didn't speak up either. The pharmaceutical representatives laughed because that was their job. Sterling looked directly at Hannah with his pale blue eyes and smiled, and then he stood up, picked up his tray, which contained an untouched salad and a bottle of sparkling water, and walked directly past her in the narrow aisle between tables. His shoulder connected with her tray. Not an accident. Not a collision that could be explained by traffic flow or distraction or the simple physics of movement in crowded spaces. A deliberate impact that sent her lunch, a sandwich from the deli counter, a paper container of pasta salad, a cup of iced tea, cascading across the floor with the specific sound of plastic containers hitting tile, of food spreading in slow motion across the cafeteria's linoleum, of a moment hanging in the air long enough for everyone to understand it wasn't an accident. The room went so quiet you could hear the ice melting in the spilled drink. Hannah didn't flinch. She didn't step back. She didn't raise her voice. She stood exactly where she was standing, and she breathed, one measured breath in through her nose, one measured breath out through her mouth, and she watched as Sterling's colleagues laughed louder, as if the laughter was a thing that needed encouragement, as if it might fade without reinforcement. The pasta salad formed a small archipelago on the floor. A piece of lettuce skidded beneath a nearby table. Sterling stood 6 feet away, watching her, waiting for the reaction he'd purchased with his position and his reputation and his certainty that she would break. "That's going to stain," Hannah said, her voice exactly level, her gaze steady on his face. "You've got balsamic dressing on your loafer." She left the mess where it was. She left the cafeteria. She left the moment intact, which was the thing that made it matter. The morning stretched thin at Mercy General. Hannah moved through the corridors with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned that invisibility was a skill, that drawing attention was a mistake, that the best nurses were the ones no one noticed. The Admiral's vitals had stabilized overnight. Room 347 was exactly where she needed to be and nowhere near Dr. Sterling's morning rounds. She was updating charts at the nurse's station when his shadow fell across the counter. Sterling read over her shoulder, his jaw moving like he was chewing glass. He'd reviewed the heparin calculation from yesterday. He knew what the numbers meant. He knew she was right and he was wrong, and knowing that in front of the interns had carved something jagged into his confidence. His hand came up. Patient files scattered like startled birds. Papers fell across the tile in a flutter of medical histories and vital sign sheets. The sound was sharp, a cascade of administrative debris that made 3 nurses look up from their computers. Hannah didn't move. She didn't flinch. She watched the papers settle. Sterling leaned closer. His voice came out sweet as syrup poured over broken glass. "Pick that up, sweetheart. It's what you're good for." His surgical team stood nearby, waiting for the entertainment, waiting for her to break. One of them smiled. Hannah could feel the weight of that smile like a hand on her neck. She took one measured breath. The tears came unbidden, a single tear that escaped down her cheek like she'd miscalculated something basic, like she'd made an error that cost a life. She didn't hide it. She didn't retreat to a supply closet or a bathroom stall. She wiped that tear away without breaking eye contact, her hand steady as a surgical laser, her voice steady as steel beneath the moisture still glistening on her skin. "I've been called worse by better men, doctor." The words landed like a scalpel. Not loud. Not angry. Just a statement of fact, delivered by someone who had been through something this cafeteria would never understand. Sterling's face flushed crimson. He opened his mouth. Then he closed it. He turned and walked away, his surgical entourage trailing behind him like disciples who'd just watched their prophet stumble. Hannah knelt to collect the scattered charts. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Whispers spread through the watching staff like ripples through still water, not the whispers she'd expected. These were different. These carried something that wasn't amusement. The interns exchanged glances. A respiratory therapist she'd never spoken to picked up 3 fallen files and placed them back on the counter beside her. No words. Just the small gesture of someone who understood that what they'd just witnessed wasn't weakness. But that wasn't the worst part. That wasn't what triggered everything that came after. Sterling returned to his private office on the 2nd floor and closed the door. His hands were shaking. Anger was useful, it clarified things, focused them down to a point sharp enough to cut. He'd built his career on precision and control, on the understanding that information was leverage and leverage was power. This nurse had somehow violated both. She'd made him look foolish in front of an intern. She'd corrected his calculation. And then she'd refused to break, refused to give him the satisfaction of watching her crumble. He picked up his phone. The first call went to board chairman Dr. Reeves, a golf partner from the country club, a man who owed Sterling 3 major referrals and understood the weight of those debts. "We have a liability issue," Sterling said carefully. "Her name is Hannah Clarke. Nurse in our cardiac unit. I need you to review her credentials thoroughly. There are inconsistencies I'm concerned about." He didn't explain what inconsistencies. He let Reeves fill in the blanks. Fear was more powerful than facts. The second call went to HR. "Run a deep background check on Nurse Clarke. Verify every reference. I need documentation of her complete employment history. Every position, every clinic, every date. There are gaps that concern me." The HR director took notes. Sterling could hear the pen moving across paper. This was how institutional power worked. You didn't need to prove anything. You just needed to plant seeds and let bureaucracy water them. The third call was to a private investigator named Marcus Webb, a man Sterling had used before for sensitive matters. "I need someone with a nursing background to interview Hannah Clarke's previous employer in Montana, a clinic called Clearwater Health. Find out if she really worked there. Find inconsistencies in her employment timeline. Find anything that doesn't add up. And find it fast." Sterling paused. She appeared 5 years ago with a nursing license and no employment history before that. 5 years. People don't materialize, Webb. Find out where she came from. The fourth call went to hospital legal counsel. "I'm documenting performance concerns regarding Nurse Clarke. She's been questioning my clinical decisions in front of medical students. She corrected my dosage calculations without proper protocol. I'm concerned about patient safety and staff morale. I want this in writing." Sterling sat back in his ergonomic chair. His office was decorated with photographs, himself at medical conferences, himself receiving an award for surgical innovation, himself on a sailboat with hospital board members. Every image reinforced the same message: he belonged at the top. This nurse, this quiet woman who showed up in scrubs 5 days a week and somehow managed to embarrass him twice in 24 hours, had no idea what she'd triggered. By noon, Chairman Reeves was already asking questions in the administrator's office. "Has anyone verified Clarke's employment history? Her previous credentials?" By 2 o'clock, HR had flagged her file as requiring expanded verification. By 4 o'clock, a form had been generated and placed in Hannah's employee mailbox requesting she provide complete documentation of all employment history prior to Mercy General. Hannah found it during her evening break. The form was official. Bland. The kind of administrative request that no one would refuse because it seemed reasonable. Routine. Standard verification. Except it wasn't. Because the truth was that Hannah's employment history before Mercy General didn't exist in any way that could be documented. The clinic in Montana had been real, a small operation where she'd worked under a different name, before that name was officially erased. The records were gone. The supervisor was dead, retired in 2014, passed away in 2016, cremated before she ever took the nursing exam. She'd been declared dead in Helmand Province. That was the official narrative. Senior Chief Petty Officer Hannah Clarke, killed in action during a classified operation that never happened. The Pentagon had ordered her records scrubbed. She'd been told to disappear. She'd followed that order for 8 years. Now she was being asked to document the years when she didn't exist. She sat in the locker room holding the jacket with the faded unit patch sewn into the lining. The patch showed the silhouettes of her platoon, 8 faces, 3 of them now gone. The Admiral was upstairs in room 347. She'd seen his name on the patient roster, Admiral Malcolm Whitmore, Naval Intelligence, retired. She'd seen his face the day he was admitted. She'd recognized him instantly. He'd carried her 3 miles through enemy fire in Helmand Province. He'd saved her life. And now she was saving his, in a hospital where she'd built an entirely new existence, one that was apparently already crumbling. The walls were closing in. She could feel it, the squeeze of bureaucracy, the weight of questions she couldn't answer, the slow constriction of a lie that had been growing larger and more complicated every single day. Her hands trembled as she ran her thumb over the unit patch, but this wasn't fear. This was restraint. This was the knowledge of exactly what she was capable of doing, and exactly how much discipline it took not to do it. Hannah closed the locker. She had 24 hours, maybe less, before someone called that defunct clinic in Montana and discovered the inconsistencies. Before someone realized that her previous employer had no record of her employment. Before the whole carefully constructed narrative collapsed like a house built on classified government documents and officially sealed records. She didn't know that Sterling was already on his third call to the investigator, already coaching board members on what questions to ask during her routine verification interview, already constructing a case for her termination that had nothing to do with his wounded pride and everything to do with protecting himself from the humiliation of being corrected by someone he dismissed as a GED nurse who needed to learn her place. What Hannah didn't know was that the Admiral's presence in Mercy General wasn't random. He'd requested to be transferred here specifically because of rumors he'd heard. An internal memo had reached someone who still owed loyalty to their old unit. Someone had whispered a name, Hannah Clarke. Someone had said, "She's alive. She's in Portland." And Admiral Whitmore had made it his personal mission to find her, to verify it with his own eyes, to understand how a woman he'd buried 8 years ago was now checking his vitals with hands as steady as a surgical laser. But he hadn't seen her face clearly yet. And she hadn't let him look. That was about to change. The investigator's report arrived on Dr. Sterling's desk at 9:48 a.m. on a Tuesday, printed on heavy stock paper that cost more than Hannah Clarke's monthly rent. 32 pages. The man who delivered it, a retired FBI agent named Kovac with a kind of face that had spent decades reading liars, summarized it in 4 sentences. No verifiable work history before 5 years ago. No family contacts we can trace. No credit history prior to 2019. No educational records from any nursing school in the continental United States. Sterling didn't ask how that was possible. He already knew. He didn't need to know. He only needed the appearance of legitimacy, and Kovac had delivered it with surgical precision. The preliminary findings were damning enough. Hannah Clarke's nursing license appeared suddenly in Oregon's licensing database on March 14, 2019, with an issue date that matched no corresponding application records. Employment gaps that couldn't be verified through normal channels. References from facilities that confirmed employment but had no original documentation on file, the kind of inconsistencies that looked less like negligence and more like erasure. Sterling spread the pages across his mahogany desk and felt something close to satisfaction bloom in his chest. This was the architecture of controlled destruction. Not loud. Not crude. Just paperwork and implications and the slow suffocation of credibility. By 10:15 a.m., Sterling had printed a curated version of the report, leaving out Kovac's notation that the employment gaps were consistent with certain government service protocols and the red-flagged note that said background may be intentionally obscured at federal level, and walked it directly to the hospital board's administrative office on the 7th floor. He didn't email it. Email left traces. Email could be forwarded. This was a hand delivery briefing, conversation only, the kind of discussion that happened in closed rooms where no minutes were recorded. The board members who owed him favors, and there were 5 of them, their obligations ranging from his intervention in a malpractice suit to his careful silence about a grandson's cocaine possession at Harbor Medical, listened to his presentation with the blank expressions of people who understood the utility of plausible deniability. "We cannot have someone with fabricated credentials treating patients," Sterling said, his voice carrying the weight of institutional concern. "It's not just a liability issue. It's a patient safety issue. She's a security risk." He watched them nod, watched them trade glances, watched them make the calculation. One board member, Patricia Chen, 64, widow, terrified of scandal, said quietly, "What do you recommend?" Sterling allowed himself a thin smile. A quiet termination. End of the week. HR can cite the credentialing discrepancies. She won't be able to dispute them without revealing information she can't reveal. They authorized it. Just like that. Without ever actually understanding what they were authorizing. Hannah noticed the changes on her second day working after Sterling's report landed. Small things. Assignments that isolated her. She was scheduled for the psychiatric ward on Thursday instead of her usual ICU rotation, then switched to night shift data entry on Friday, her name appearing on the schedule at the last possible moment. On Wednesday, she grabbed her chart for the morning medication pass and found the color-coded patient list had been reorganized without notification, her familiar assignment scattered across 3 different floors. The worst part was the silence. She passed colleagues in the hallway and caught the moment when recognition hit their faces, followed immediately by the deliberate pivot of their eyes away from hers. No good morning. No chat about the previous night's cases. Just the sudden discovery of an urgent task that required immediate attention in the opposite direction. She understood the mechanics. Word had reached them, something about her background, something about her records, something that made her untouchable in the way that contagion made people untouchable. Hannah had been trained to read atmospheres the way other people read books. Helmand Province taught that skill with brutal efficiency. In 2013, when Taliban fighters moved through villages disguised as civilians, the difference between living and dying often came down to reading the microscopic shift in a child's posture, the almost imperceptible delay in a shopkeeper's greeting. That same instrument was vibrating now, warning her that the ground beneath her careful 5-year construction was shifting. But she had no way to stop it without revealing why the ground existed in the first place. On Thursday morning, she reported to work for the 6 a.m. shift and discovered her assignment had changed again. Pediatric ward. Outpatient clinic support. Nothing with the Admiral. Nothing with intensive monitoring. Nothing that mattered. She changed into her scrubs in the break room, the same break room where she'd eaten her balsamic-drenched salad while Sterling knocked her tray to the floor, and clipped her badge to her pocket. The badge held her credentials. The badge said she was who she claimed to be. The badge was a very good lie. The faded unit patch was sewn into the lining of her jacket, the one she kept in her locker for emergencies, the fabric so worn that the colors had nearly disappeared into a uniform gray. 3 names were embroidered on it in letters so small only she could see them anymore. Reeves. Morrison. Halloway. 3 of 8. Hannah touched the stitching the way other people touched religious medals, and then she moved toward the pediatric ward. Her phone buzzed at 10:32 a.m. A text from the ICU charge nurse, HR wants to see you end of shift. Nothing urgent, just paperwork. Paperwork. That word carried the weight of inevitability. Hannah kept working through the shift, took temperatures, adjusted full lines, charted medications for children too young to understand that the woman treating them was about to disappear. She moved through it all with the same mechanical precision she'd once used to treat casualties in a field hospital that never officially existed. Around noon, someone in the hallway mentioned that the Admiral's numbers had been looking good, that he was probably going to be discharged early next week, back to his home in Medford, back to his daughter's house overlooking the Rogue River. She allowed herself exactly 1 moment of something that might have been relief. Then, at 2:48 p.m., while she was documenting pediatric vitals, the monitor in the cardiac ward 3 floors up showed something that wouldn't appear anywhere in Hannah's awareness for another 4 minutes, but when it did, it would change the entire geometry of the next 72 hours. The Admiral's heart rate elevated from a stable 68 to a racing 104. His blood pressure, which had been holding steady at 132/78 all morning, began a slow drift downward. 130/76. 128/75. The kind of gradual decline that could be dismissed as positional at first, the patient shifting in bed or anxiety about discharge papers. But Hannah wasn't there to see it. Hannah was in pediatrics, documenting a 5-year-old's post-op recovery, and the distance between her and room 347 might as well have been 3 miles all over again, the way that certain geography meant certain deaths. What happened next didn't just change the room, it changed everything. The code alarm sounded at 2:51 p.m. 3 short electronic bursts followed by the overhead announcement, Code Blue, Cardiac Ward, Room 347. Code Blue, Cardiac Ward. Hannah's hand stilled over the keyboard. She heard the overhead announcement the way soldiers hear mortar fire, not with conscious comprehension, but with the reactive understanding of her nervous system. That was the Admiral's room. That was the man whose call sign no one could know she remembered. That was the patient Sterling had explicitly pulled her off of. She stood up from the computer, moved toward the hallway, heard the crash cart rushing toward the elevators, the coordinated chaos of an entire floor pivoting toward emergency. The pediatric nurse manager looked at her with tired eyes. "You should stay here. We've got this covered." Hannah nodded and didn't leave. She waited until the manager turned back to her documentation, and then she moved toward the stairwell. The cardiac floor was controlled chaos when she arrived. Sterling was already there, moving with the unhurried precision of someone who knew he had time. His voice came through the communication headset, calm, measured, describing the procedure he was about to perform with the confidence of a man who had never been wrong about anything. "Get me a 14-gauge angiocath and a 50-milliliter syringe for pericardiocentesis. Cardiac tamponade presentation. I'm assessing for fluid now." But Sterling wasn't moving fast. Sterling was explaining his movements as he made them, the way people did when they were teaching, when they were demonstrating their competence for an audience. Hannah watched through the observation window. She'd positioned herself where she could see the monitor without being seen, and saw what he couldn't see yet because he wasn't the one looking at the monitor screen. The Admiral's blood pressure was 72/48 and still dropping. The heart rate had climbed to 142. The jugular veins were distending like rope pulled tight. This wasn't a routine complication anymore. This was a man whose heart was being compressed by fluid accumulation, whose coronary perfusion was collapsing, who had maybe 3 minutes before his pressure dropped below sustainable limits. Sterling was still explaining, still moving with the precision of routine. The charge nurse stood ready with equipment. The resident waited for direction. Hannah reached for the door handle. The rubber of the frame was cold under her palm. She thought of Helmand Province, of carrying the Admiral 3 miles through enemy fire while rounds kicked up dust around them. She thought of the protocol that no one left behind didn't have asterisks or exceptions. She thought of 5 years of silence measured against 3 minutes of life. The code team didn't notice her enter because they weren't looking for her. They were looking at monitors and charts and the body on the bed. Hannah moved to the medication cart, grabbed what she needed, the muscle memory of her real training superseding the 5-year performance of someone named Clarke, and walked directly to the bedside. "Step back," she said. Her voice sounded like it belonged to someone else. Dr. Sterling's hands froze. He turned to her with an expression somewhere between confusion and fury. "Get out of my OR. You're under investigation." Hannah already had the needle in her hand. 14-gauge angiocath. The approach point was the 5th intercostal space at the mid-axillary line, the needle angled toward the heart, away from the pericardium. She'd done this in a desert surgical tent with a flashlight and blood on her hands. She could do it in a Portland cardiac ward with fluorescent lights and an audience. "You have 45 seconds, she said. Then he dies." The alarm screamed at 2:13 a.m., a sound like a siren tearing through flesh. Room 347. The Admiral's monitors erupted in a chaos of beeping that made every nurse on the cardiac floor jerk upright. Hannah was already moving before the code was called, her body responding to something that lived deeper than conscious thought, muscle memory that knew danger the way some people knew their own heartbeat. The Admiral's blood pressure was collapsing. 80/50. 70/40. The numbers falling like a body through darkness. His surgeon, Dr. Sterling, was still in the scrub room, his hands beneath running water, his back turned to the emergency unfolding 3 doors away. Hannah reached the bedside in 4 seconds flat. The attending resident stood frozen, staring at the monitor as if reading it might change the numbers. Pericardiocentesis kit. Now, Hannah said. Her voice wasn't loud. It was something else entirely, the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst, a certainty that made every nerve in the room snap to attention. A surgical nurse hesitated, her eyes flicking toward the scrub room where Sterling's shadow moved behind frosted glass. Hannah's voice dropped lower, somehow more commanding, now. The nurse moved. Some people recognize authority the way animals recognize a predator, not because it's loud, but because it's real. The kit appeared in Hannah's hands 30 seconds later, the pericardiocentesis needle gleaming under the overhead lights like something surgical and inevitable. Hannah's hands moved with the terrifying fluid precision of a surgeon who had trained on human bodies in conditions that didn't allow for hesitation. She prepped the subxiphoid area with chlorhexidine, her touch steady as a laser, while 17 people crowded the window overlooking the surgical floor. Residents. Nurses. An intern barely out of nursing school. All of them watching this probationary nurse, the one they'd been told would be gone by next week, move into a space that belonged only to attending physicians. The needle advanced at a 45-degree angle toward the left shoulder, Hannah's breathing barely audible, her concentration a visible thing, something that made the air around her seem to thicken. She felt for the resistance, felt for the moment when the pericardium would give way, felt for the thin boundary between precision and disaster. Dark blood filled the syringe. Immediate blood. The Admiral's pressure stabilized before she even withdrew the needle completely. 85/60. 90/60. The numbers climbing like a rope being thrown to a drowning man. Through the window, 20 people stood in absolute silence. Mouths open. Eyes fixed. The kind of stunned stillness that follows witnessing something impossible made routine by someone's hands. Dr. Sterling burst through the operating room doors fully gowned, his mask hanging around his neck, his face already reddening with whatever words were forming in his throat. "What the hell do you think you're?" He stopped. His eyes moved from Hannah's blood-stained gloves to the syringe of pericardial fluid to the Admiral's normalizing vital signs. To the catheter that had no business being placed by anyone except the attending surgeon standing in his scrubs 2 feet away. Hannah stepped back without a word. She could feel Sterling's stare like a hand closing around her throat, but her face remained neutral, her posture unchanged. The Admiral's pressure continued climbing. 95/65. The room had stopped being an operating theater and become something else entirely, a stage where everybody in Portland's most prestigious cardiac program had just watched a probationary nurse with fabricated credentials perform an emergency intervention with the precision of someone who had trained under fire. Sterling's jaw worked soundlessly. He looked at his patient. He looked at Hannah. He looked back at the patient. Then he turned and walked out of the room, his shoulders rigid, his silence somehow louder than any words could have been. In that moment, he understood something his mind wouldn't let him articulate. He had just lost control of a situation he'd spent 2 weeks meticulously orchestrating. Within an hour, Sterling was in the hospital board chairman's office on the executive level, his tie pulled loose, his voice carrying the particular fury of a man whose authority had been publicly dismantled. She performed an invasive procedure without attending authorization. She violated direct orders to leave the case. She contaminated the operating room environment without proper surgical protocols. I want her terminated immediately. Today. His hands shook as he spoke, and the board chairman, a man who had known Sterling for 20 years, barely recognized the voice coming from his oldest colleague's mouth. The board voted in 12 minutes. Protocol violation. Insubordination. Credentials requiring further investigation. Her employment status would be conditional on completion of the background verification that Sterling's investigator was still assembling. The recommendation was termination effective immediately. Hannah was called to Human Resources at 5:44 p.m. The HR director wouldn't meet her eyes. "We need to suspend your credentials pending investigation. Your background verification is incomplete. Gaps we can't account for." The words came out practiced, rehearsed. Sterling had prepared his ground carefully, had made the calls that needed making. "We're offering 2 weeks of severance and a neutral reference." You'll need to surrender your badge and exit through the employee entrance. She didn't argue. Arguing would mean talking, and talking would mean explaining things that couldn't be explained to someone who lacked the clearance to hear them. She had known this was coming. She'd always known. That was the contract she'd signed with the Navy 5 years ago when they told her that her old life was officially over, that her records would be sealed, that she'd been declared dead to the world so that an operation in Helmand Province that saved 42 American lives could remain classified until the heat death of the universe. Hannah walked to her locker. The lock opened with her thumbprint. She'd installed it herself on the first day, a small piece of operational security in a hospital where nobody knew she carried that kind of training. Inside was the cracked mug that said "World's Okayest Nurse" in faded letters, a gift from someone 3 jobs ago who'd known nothing about her except that she made good coffee and asked good questions. A dying succulent in a ceramic pot, something green that she'd watered exactly twice since she'd brought it in, that had somehow survived through sheer spite. And the photograph, 8 faces, some alight on their skin, weapons slung across their chests, arms around each other in the moment before everything burned. 3 of those faces had excess through them now. Permanent markers. The kind of crosses that didn't get undone. She took the jacket. The one with the unit patch sewn inside the lining, a piece of fabric that would tell anyone with the right training exactly who she'd been, what she'd done, where she'd bled. Nobody at Mercy General would find it. They'd throw the jacket in a donation bin or incinerator and never know what they'd destroyed. Rain began as she reached the bus stop outside Mercy General's main entrance, the kind of cold Portland rain that felt personal, like the sky itself was making a statement. Hannah clutched the cardboard box against her ribs, and the rain began soaking through the bottom seams, the cardboard breaking down, dissolving like evidence. A photograph slipped out into the wet sidewalk, her unit in Helmand Province, August 2016, the moment before everything changed. She picked it up from the puddle, water streaming from the edges, and stood there with her hands shaking for the first time all day. Not from fear. From restraint. The kind of trembling that comes from holding so much inside for so long that your own bones ache with the weight of it. She wondered if she'd ever stop running. She wondered if this was what exhaustion actually felt like, or if she'd simply forgotten what the original version of tired felt like anymore. The bus arrived at 6:12 p.m., and Hannah Clarke climbed aboard with a cardboard box dissolving in her hands and a photograph that proved she'd been someone once, someone real, someone worth remembering. That was the last time anyone at Mercy General would see her before everything changed. The Admiral's eyes opened fully at 6:38 a.m., and the room shifted. Administrators had gathered in the hallway outside room 347, clipboard and termination paperwork in hand, voices low and procedural. Nobody expected what would happen next. Hannah was finishing her final rounds before security escorted her out, one last walk through the ward that had been her entire identity for 5 years. She moved between monitors and 4 lines with the same precision she'd maintained all night, muscle memory taking over as her mind prepared for erasure. The pericardiocentesis had saved his life, but it had destroyed hers. Protocol violation. Insubordination. The official language of her own erasure. She entered room 347 to check the Admiral's responsiveness one final time. His oxygen saturation was climbing steadily, 88, now 91, now 94. Sinus rhythm held. Strong. The man she'd carried 3 miles through enemy fire in Helmand Province lay before her, still healing, still unaware of who had just pulled him back from the edge. She leaned close, checking his pupils, assessing the subtle signs of consciousness returning. His eyes focused. They locked directly onto hers. And in that moment, his voice emerged, barely audible, rough from the ventilator that had been removed 6 hours earlier. One word. A single word that made the entire room collapse inward. Valkyrie. Her classified call sign. The name she'd worn in the dark. Her hands didn't tremble. Her breathing didn't change. But time stopped. The Admiral's eyes held hers with absolute recognition, and Hannah understood that the 5 years of invisibility were fracturing, fragmenting, falling away like concrete under artillery fire. She stepped back. The monitors continued their steady beeping, the sound of a heart that wouldn't stop, that couldn't stop, that wouldn't be ignored any longer. The Admiral's grown daughter entered the room moments later, her voice shaking as she approached the bedside. "Your Senior Chief Petty Officer Clarke." Not a question. A statement spoken with the kind of certainty that came from classified briefings and official letters bearing Pentagon seals. Hannah turned to face her, and the daughter's eyes filled with tears. "My father has talked about you for 7 years. Ever since Helmand. He said you carried him for kilometers through a firefight." For kilometers. The official distance was slightly different, but the truth was the same, measured in heartbeats and bullets and decisions that separated life from death. The attending nurse, the one who'd watched Hannah perform the pericardiocentesis, entered with trembling hands, holding the Admiral's field journal. The pages had been kept in a safe deposit box since his retirement, classified documentation that documented every operation, every action, every moment of heroism or survival. Her voice broke as she read aloud, "Petty Officer Clarke performed emergency life-saving intervention under fire with 2 rounds impacting within 3 feet of her position. Remained at patient side for 72 minutes despite active engagement. Probability of survival without her intervention, 5%. The nurse looked up, tears streaming down her face. There are 17 pages. Just 17 pages of citations. Navy Cross. 2 silver stars. Purple Heart. And it says here she was declared. The nurse couldn't finish. A SEAL team leader stood in the doorway, still wearing his dress uniform from the red-eye flight into Portland International. He was a man made of precision and respect, the kind of warrior who understood what invisibility cost. He stepped forward and came to attention beside Hannah's bed, not the Admiral's. His voice carried the weight of official recognition, Navy Cross. First Silver Star, Helmand Province, 2014. Second Silver Star, Helmand Province, 2015. Purple Heart, 2 citations. Each medal was its own sentence. Each one a beat of silence. You saved 42 American lives that we know of. Officially? You were never there. The FBI agent who'd been standing quietly in the corner of the room stepped forward, badge visible on his belt, voice steady and flat. He addressed the hospital board chairman directly. Senior Chief Petty Officer Clarke's nursing credentials are legitimate and current. They were issued under federal identity protection protocols required by the classified operation that concluded in 2016. Her background cannot be fully verified because it is need-to-know only. She was officially declared deceased to protect the operational security of the mission she led. He paused, letting that reality settle like sediment into water. 42 Americans came home because of her. That is not speculation. That is fact. 5 floors down, in his office, Dr. Sterling sat at his desk with shaking hands. The walls around him felt like they were contracting, squeezing the air from his lungs. He'd heard fragments of conversation in the hallway, classified, military, Navy Cross, and the words had hit him like cardiac defibrillator paddles. His entire vendetta had been built on a single assumption, that Hannah Clarke was nobody. That she could be crushed. That she should disappear. Now the Admiral was awake and naming her, the nurses were weeping, and he understood with a clarity that felt like a ice water injection that he'd tried to destroy someone he couldn't even begin to understand. His fingers moved across the keyboard with the desperation of a drowning man reaching for anything solid. He opened Hannah's personnel file and began typing, fabricating timeline markers, creating false documentation that would prove he'd flagged inconsistencies weeks ago. He wasn't trying to hurt her anymore, she was already beyond his reach. He was trying to save himself. He composed an email to hospital security dated 2 weeks prior, detailing his supposed concerns about her credentials. He created a memo backdated to the day she'd been hired, noting suspicious gaps in her employment history. Every keystroke was a lie. Every keystroke was recorded. 2 FBI cyber agents stood in his doorway without announcement. They weren't there to arrest him yet, that came later. They were there to watch. Dr. Sterling, step away from the computer. His voice rose, desperate and shrill. I was protecting this hospital. She had a fake background, false credentials. The agent's response came in the tone of someone explaining obvious facts to a child. Her credentials are legitimate and classified. And you just committed felony obstruction of federal employment protection by attempting to forge documentation. Sterling's medical license, the agent continued, was under review. The hospital board was prepared to recommend permanent revocation. By the time the handcuffs were applied, Sterling had aged 10 years in 6 hours. By noon, he was walking through the hospital in restraints, security on both sides, past the same cafeteria where he'd knocked Hannah's lunch tray to the floor. The lunch crowd went silent. Forks paused mid-bite. A resident whispered something to an intern, and both of their faces went pale. The surgeon who'd laughed at the incident turned away. Sterling's face had the grey pallor of a man watching his entire world collapse in real time. The sound of his footsteps on the tile was steady and precise. 1, 2, 3, 4, the cadence of a condemned man walking toward consequences that couldn't be negotiated or appealed. Hannah watched from the second-floor window, no expression crossing her face. The Admiral's daughter stood beside her, watching her father's tormentor being escorted from the building that had never truly been his kingdom. "He thought you were weak." The daughter's voice carried an edge that matched Hannah's own. Hannah's response came quietly, measured, the voice of someone who'd spent 5 years understanding the cost of invisibility. They always do. She didn't watch Sterling's perp walk to completion. She turned back toward the room where the Admiral lay sleeping, where medals were being discussed in whispered conversations, where her classified past was finally becoming visible. 5 years would pass before the consequences fully settled. A hospital janitor, taking his afternoon break at a strip mall in suburban Portland, reported seeing a gaunt man at a folding table selling insurance policies to pedestrians who hurried past without stopping. No one recognized him. No one wanted what he was offering. The medical board's revocation of his license had been permanent, the FBI charges substantial, the divorce finalized, the house foreclosed. Sterling had become invisible in the exact way he'd tried to force Hannah to remain. The irony was wasted on him. Inside Mercy General's main entrance, a bronze plaque was unveiled on the morning of the Admiral's official discharge. The hospital staff gathered, nurses in their navy scrubs, residents learning to stand straighter, administrative personnel understanding finally what true service looked like. The Admiral stood in his full dress uniform, medals across his chest, his daughter beside him. The SEAL team attended. And Hannah Clarke stood in her navy dress uniform, the decorations visible now, the call sign no longer classified. The plaque read, "In honor of Senior Chief Petty Officer Hannah Clarke, United States Navy, Navy Cross, Silver Star." She served in silence. She saved lives in the dark. She reminded us that heroism does not ask for recognition. Her photograph showed her in uniform, jaw set, eyes forward, finally visible, finally whole. Beside the plaque, in a glass case, hung the faded unit patch from her jacket lining, 8 names embroidered in gold thread, 3 of them crossed out in permanent marker. Those names would be preserved forever, along with her identity, no longer needing to hide. The Admiral placed his hand on her shoulder, and the tattooed forearm was visible, Valkyrie inked into his skin in letters that would fade only with death. Her medical badge now read Hannah Clarke, RN, BSN, Senior Clinical Advisor, and nurses stood straighter when she passed through the corridors of Mercy General. Residents asked her questions with genuine respect. She walked the same halls that had nearly swallowed her, but now the hospital itself seemed to recognize what she'd always been. You do not need a badge or a gun to be a warrior. You just need to stand up when everyone else is looking away. Subscribe to see more stories of hidden strength finally recognized. Like this video if you believe in honoring those who serve in silence. And comment, have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value?